Welcome to a Barnardos Australia podcast. My name is Matt Huey and I'm the Head of Practice and Impact. We're talking about children, the hidden victims of domestic and family violence. We have a guest, Delia Donovan, and our CEO, Deirdre Cheers. Delia, would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Absolutely, Matt. Hi, everybody. I'm Delia Donovan. I'm the CEO of Domestic Violence New South Wales. We're the peak body that represents over 150 life-saving organisations across the state.
Thank you, and it's absolutely incredible having you a part of the conversation here today. And we've also got Deirdre Cheers, our CEO at Barnardos. Do you want to do a quick hello?
Hello, I'm Deirdre Cheers. I've been CEO of Barnardos since 2015. I'm a social worker by training, and I've seen over my career a big change in the way in which we even recognise domestic and family violence. So I'm particularly interested in this conversation because it's such an area of focus now, as it needs to be.
Absolutely, and focus it is because we are in the 16 Days of Activism, which is a global campaign that is about building awareness against gender-based violence. So before we get into any content, I think it's really important that we have a trigger warning because we will be talking about domestic and family violence throughout this podcast today, and there'll be different stories, impact, research and conversations that do happen. So please look after yourself, and if you do need support, 1-800-RESPECT will always be there for you. I'd like to start this podcast by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' continued connection to land, waters and community, and pay my respects to elders past, present and our children and young people emerging. I am committed to approaching culture with humility, respect and curiosity, and we're on Gadigal land today. So Deirdre, Barnardos is quite a large organisation impacting children and families across New South Wales and the ACT. And with all the programs and services, why should we be paying such a focus on domestic and family violence?
Well, I think if we just reflect back on the last 6 weeks or so, we have seen an extraordinary number of women actually killed, including a woman in my own suburb, only several streets away. And I live in an ordinary suburban area. I have 3 schools within a radius of probably 1.5 kilometres and 5 primary schools. So primary schools, I'm talking about 5 primary schools within 3 kilometres. So there are a lot of children where I live. And the reality is that this happens everywhere. In all our Barnardos centres, we have a range of programs, but the common denominator increasingly is domestic and family violence. No matter what brings people to our door, we don't often know straight away, but underlying many family-related problems is domestic and family violence.
And so is that what you're seeing with domestic violence in New South Wales?
Yeah, we're certainly seeing that community attitudes are a concern for us at this point, and domestic and family violence is everywhere and it certainly doesn't discriminate. We know from the National Community Attitude Survey that over half of the Australians that were surveyed believe that domestic violence doesn't happen in their suburb. And we've just recently lost 58 women to domestic and family violence across Australia. So this isn't about discriminating in postcodes. This happens everywhere. And particularly children and young people are often the silent and forgotten victims of domestic and family violence. They tend to not have a voice. They tend to not have the right services and support. And it's an underfunded space. So we're really keen to advocate that children and young people are seen and heard. And there's the recovery services to support them.
You made a really good point then about children being often the hidden victims within different situations. There's a lot of media coverage. Why do you think, Deirdre, that children might be suffering, still suffering in the public agenda of not having their voices heard or considered?
Well, I think it's one of those issues where people not only don't think it's going to happen in their sphere of living, but it's also something that's uncomfortable to actually talk about. And so for people who have experienced it directly, let alone children, it's not exactly a social conversation topic. So, and for children, we at Barnardos did a national survey in the last year, and the finding that really jumped out at me was that people who told us as adults how very much living with violence had impacted them, also told us that they had told, for instance, their teacher or someone at school, and children spend a lot of time at school. It's a very normal environment for children, but they weren't heard. And so if in an environment like a school with teachers who are trained to teach children and know a lot about children, who've done a lot about child development, if that message is not picked up on and heard, then children are left very, very powerless. And children don't take much to feel that something's not okay to talk about.
So you have extensive history working with domestic and family violence here in Australia, but also back in the UK, and a range of different children and family services. When did you think, or when did you kind of pinpoint a time in your career where you realised that children's voices weren't being heard in this conversation?
That's a really great question. I think there's been lots of different parts of my career and journey where I've seen it's really become quite prominent. And I guess when I was doing my social work course, I chose domestic violence as a module in my course. So it wasn't actually in the social work course, which I think is something that's really important that we really think about too. And I then went as a social work student, and who I should mention was managing children's homes at this point. I was 24 and I'd been managing therapeutic communities for kids. So very much had a children and young people's background and experience. Went as a social work student to The Refuge, an amazing organisation called DASH, Domestic Abuse Stops Here, and noted through no fault of the organisation's own, the focus was on the mother. And of course it should be, and there needs to, you need to obviously acknowledge the protective factors of the mother and that strength-based work and what mum's doing. But there was no one really saying, wow, what can we do with the kids? Do they need therapeutic work, direct work? Are we doing group work with the kids? There was no actual responses, and there were some safeguards I saw missing as a pending social worker. So I was actually invited back to set the Children's Services team up at DASH, the first of its kind in the UK back in 2009. And we were really fortunate to get philanthropy and grants and support to start looking at lots of tailored and different services for kids, not one size fits all, of course. So looking at work for kids in the refuge, and often, as you all know, kids will blame themselves. And they needed an outlet to be able to talk about how they felt. And they didn't maybe understand what domestic violence looked like. And there was lots of things that we could do in the refuge, in the community, because the organisation worked outside of the refuge. It worked in the community with thousands of clients. And we went into schools as well to look at cultural change in schools. So that was a big learning phase in my journey. My second probably look at kind of the prevention side of things was coming to Australia and working at White Ribbon Australia and really looking at the prevention work that needed to be done. And that was almost another moment of, gosh, we're in an echo chamber. In our sector, we are passionate, tireless, we work so hard, but conversations in the community aren't happening. And that was another bit of a moment of, gosh, we've got our work cut out for us. And we continue to have our work cut out for us. But those are probably two key moments of seeing, gosh, children and young people, we need to be doing more. And we need to be doing much more in the community around attitudes, because as Deirdre just mentioned, I was at a vigil a few weeks ago where we noted the tragic deaths of women that we've lost in Australia. And passers-by kind of go, oh, what's that woman speaking about up on the stage? Oh, yeah, we'll keep going off for our work drinks tonight. And as you said, it's an awkward conversation, and we've got to make it a whole of community conversation. We've got to make people care about this. This is happening everywhere. It's infiltrating institutions. You only have to listen to the radio stations in the morning, the mainstream ones particularly, who are so derogatory about women. And the language used is unacceptable, and it lends itself to the murder. I'm sorry, that's a scary thing to say, but it's the truth. And we've got to really start thinking about language.
Absolutely. It comes back to something you also mentioned, you both kind of touched on, is that conversation and having that conversation in the community, but even just listening to you now as a social work student, that wasn't at the forefront of the core subjects, and what we're kind of teaching our future practice as well, and how to have those conversations is really crucial. So Deirdre, you've been in the sector for a long time and advocating strongly for children on a range of different issues. Reflecting on the past decade, what's really stood out for you in terms of putting children's voices at the forefront with domestic and family violence?
So, look, it's been nearly 10 years since Luke Batty was killed by his father. That was a crime that I think shocked Australia and resonated particularly, notwithstanding Rosie Batty and the very big public profile that she took on and the fabulous advocacy work. However, she was a very ordinary middle Australian. And so it's always easy, and in my career I have seen and I still see people treated as the other. Oh, that could never happen in my family, that could never happen here, that would not happen to my children. So you see that still in social workers occasionally, who, as a way of distancing themselves from the difficulty of the work, you can't see that that could ever happen to them. But the reality of domestic and family violence is that it is everywhere. It's classless. It is not linked especially to how much money is in a household, or whether there are other sorts of problems like substance abuse or anything you can think of. So the killing of Luke Batty, I think, was a watershed moment for Australia, because he was just an ordinary little boy at cricket, and his mother was a very ordinary woman there watching, and she had done the best she could to distance herself from the violence and to make a life for her child that didn't have violence in it, and he died, and that was shocking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you both mentioned that it happens anywhere at any time, and what I've definitely heard from this conversation already is we need more community awareness of how to respond.
And people don't know what to do. I mean, that's the other thing. When I mentioned earlier that there had been a woman a few streets from me that died, within 2 or 3 days, I was astounded to see in the local social media a community vigil, hundreds and hundreds of people. So people are getting it. They are definitely getting it, but no one knows what to do.
Yeah, that's a big journey, and that's a big ladder to climb. And back in 2014, there was specialist workers across the whole state of New South Wales in refuges, and those children's specialist workers were always part of the response as they needed to be. In 2014, there were reforms which lost those workers. So in 2021, when government kind of said to us, what do we need to be funding? And obviously they do lean on us as peak body to provide that advice. We said we need to get children's workers back into refuges. So we got 20 workers back into the refuges. Of course, there's 80 plus refuges and more to be built at the moment, so it was a small pilot. And then changing government meant we nearly lost them again, until recently, where we had to say to Labour, who are in, oh my goodness, this needs to be continued, this is an absolute priority even though you've got this deficit budget. So we got the 20 workers back in, but it's been a slog, and there will be a submission to government in the next month or so, and DV New South Wales will be calling on statewide children's specialist workers in all refuges across the state. And not just in refuges. As I mentioned in the work I did in the UK, we set a children's services response up for children in refuge, but children in the community. So we'd like to see children's specialist workers in other organisations, possibly Barnardos, doing that kind of work with children impacted by domestic violence. So it's a ladder to climb, but we absolutely have to have those resources and supports for children and young people.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure I can speak for Deirdre. We'll definitely welcome those.
Of course.
Those
we'll talk more, of course.
We'll talk more as well.
Of course. And look, the more people with the right skills to work directly with children are embedded in local, ordinary old services where people can come in without having to go, oh, I need to see the DV worker. I mean, no one likes doing that. No one's going to do that. Where they can come, like our children's family centres, for childcare, for local support, for parenting advice, come to a cooking group. We see that increasingly domestic and family violence is a common denominator. People don't talk about it until, they're sort of over a cup of coffee sideways mentioning it. They don't want to ring up and make an appointment with a DV specialist. They want to feel normal and safe, but we need the skilled people in there, and we particularly need them for children.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's the beauty of the Child Family Centre model, is you can come in to get to know the service, and then it opens up doors for you, and sometimes it's about educating as well, not only educating the community, but also educating those who are impacted that they are being impacted as well. Because we did see with that report, there's different kind of feelings that comes. Shame comes with some, embarrassment, not sure what to do, what it is, because we talk sometimes about generational stuff that comes through as well.
Yes.
And acknowledging that even as a workforce, we need to understand what domestic and family violence, and as Deirdre just mentioned, I think it's key that everybody can respond. We know that it isn't maybe in everyone's social work course or people studying at TAFE when they're looking at family work, and we do need a domestic violence informed workforce, and that means understanding trauma, safety and risk, and being person-centred. And some of those skill sets, of course, exist within our workers, but understanding the safety and the risk, I think, is always key with domestic and family violence, and knowing how risk can escalate quickly when someone possibly has separated from the perpetrator.
And it's the ability, I think, to have people feel that it's okay to say something's not okay. Just calling it out, the act of calling it out, and children can be really good at that, saying this is not okay. That's the biggest thing, I think, for the predominant community, because they don't feel safe to say it's not okay. And it's good to say that's not okay. Calling something out is often the first step to stopping it.
Yeah, absolutely. We've mentioned education a few times as well, and you're also saying that, you know, a lot of the families that come to our services are experiencing domestic and family violence. How can we, adding those kind of 2 points together, how can we best train our future practitioners, social workers, social scientists, psychologists, whatever your role is within the sector, to best be able to respond to families, but more importantly, children, and having their voices heard?
I think looking at what's already existing and making sure we can be strength-based with already existing training like DV Alert. There's 1-800-RESPECT. They've got great resources and tools and online options as well. So I think thinking about what's already existing, and certainly my role as leading a peak body is to make sure I'm advocating for that change, so that, for example, we're looking at minimum standards in the domestic violence space in New South Wales, which will be fantastic, and we want to professionalise the sector. But we also don't want to overqualify the sector too, in the way that not everyone's going to have access to social work courses, and we need to make sure that we can advocate for every level of education and training that we think about domestic and family violence, and that it's really recognised in those institutions. And I think in schools as well, making sure it isn't just fly in and fly out work, that there's actually whole of school culture around respect, and making sure those teachers are really taking that on board as well.
And I think, you know, there's a point of view that says as well that rather than seeing this as a problem to be fixed, we need to reframe that conversation into a conversation about that we all have responsibility for personal safety, and not just our own personal safety, but other people's personal safety. And where children are involved, they're dependent. They don't have the ability necessarily to be in control of what's happening around them. Mostly they're not in control of what's happening around them. So it's not a problem to be fixed. It's a shared responsibility to ensure that children are safe.
Yeah.
And to Deirdre's point, I think the bit where we often say it takes a village to raise a child, this issue takes a village. So I think we need to take that community-owned and driven approach to this issue.
And considering it's a large-scale kind of approach that you're talking about, do you think that the New South Wales child protection system is effectively responding to children in domestic and family violence situations?
Well, that's a bit of a loaded question in relation to what is child protection and what is it meant to do. So we have in you know, the era we live in, across most Western societies, quite sophisticated child protection reporting laws, and a range of issues for which a lot of professionals are mandated to report to statutory child protection. And in some ways that's a good thing, but in other ways it lets people off the hook, because they make the phone call, they've reported, well, I've done my bit, now it's up to someone else. But actually, it's never just up to someone else, because you don't want to be taking children away from their families, and you don't want to report children when there are other ways of actually assisting that family. And that's where the issue of shared responsibility comes in. So the the reporting of children exposed to domestic and family violence in New South Wales is quite old, and probably 20, it might even be more than that, years old, 25 or even 30 years old. And I think at the time people felt that, well, that's really good, we need to report it because that child's been exposed to domestic and family violence. But in reality, that does not mean that family will get assistance. It does not mean that additional services will be put into that family. And that's symbolic of the fact that children are not necessarily seen as victims in their own right, even though the reporting laws say you have to report it. So it needs, I think, a much bigger picture approach to look at the fact that child protection, everyone feels safe and good that we have child protection and mandatory reporting laws, but in reality you don't want to, nor can you take children away from their families unless they're in the most dire of circumstances. So we need a much more broad community responsibility for this.
I do think, having worked in that more the child protection space and then moving into the domestic violence space, that we can tend to victim blame parents.
Absolutely.
Particularly the surviving mother. And I think that, I know Barnardos is really passionate about the Safe and Together model as well. But I can think back in the day where it's constantly on a child protection plan, mum must do X, mum must do Y, mum, all the responsibility, the view was completely off the perpetrator. And I do think that has to change, and I think it's still very much existing, and I think we need to see much better integration and sharing of information with housing, with mental health, with child protection, with police. And something that's been really positive in New South Wales is we've got the Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Services, 5, now 10, based in police offices. And I really like those types of models where there's specialist workers going into maybe the police station or specialist workers going into the hospital. And we need to start being more creative because the system maybe isn't fit for purpose at this time. And I do think, nobody wants to be removing children at all, but there's such a fear from families that is going to happen, particularly First Nations, where we see that play out so badly. So we do need to think about the system not being abusive to those surviving domestic and family violence.
Absolutely. And it comes to your point as well, that you were mentioning earlier about the prevention work that needs to be put in place, or the focus on that prevention work. Because we don't want to see kids coming into care or away from their families. We want to see them being safe at home with their families. In the National Plan and the 5-year action plan, it recognises children as victims, survivors, and outlined it as a priority. What do you think can be done to really enforce that, or kind of advocate that children are being seen and heard in this space?
That's a really good question, Matt. I think it's really important that, we're recognising children and young people in their own context as victims in their own right, and that we're elevating their voices. And we know that the National Plan does assert that that's very, very important. What I'd certainly like to see from Domestic Violence New South Wales' perspective is funding attached to that, so that we really look at making sure we're funding a variety of responses for children and young people across a range of services. It's positive that we do have a federal Domestic and Family Violence Commissioner, and it's positive that New South Wales has a standalone Women's Safety Commissioner. So I know that there's some great allies in the space that are really listening to the sector, and I really hope they can help support movement with that national plan, because a plan is just a plan if we don't have funding attached or if we don't have clear actions. So it's really, really key that those in positions of power or those in positions of advocacy roles can really, really push forward with what that actually looks like. What does elevating voices look like in practice?
One of the other things I think that's really important is how national plans, this one and any others, because we have a number of them, because Australia is a federation and because the federal responsibilities are not directly connected with things like policing, things like child welfare, their state and territory responsibilities. So its success lies in the ability of the federal government to actually hold our state and territory governments to account in both funding and then reporting back achievements, because on their own, either party can escape responsibility, because at the national level, our Australian government isn't directly responsible for domestic and family violence. That's a state and territory jurisdiction responsibility. So, but they need to actually take some responsibility around that broader funding issue, because it's a national problem. It's a national issue.
So Victoria's now implemented a new program, Respectful Relationships, a part of their school curriculum. Where do you see New South Wales or the national conversation about how we can educate children within the education system to really shine a light on their voice and the impacts of DFE?
So we know Victoria's quite ahead of the game when it comes to respectful relationships education work, and they've done an awful lot in the space, particularly having Rosie Batty and the Royal Commission. So there's been significant investment in Victoria, which is great. And in New South Wales, we've had some great programs, but some that have kind of been maybe funded by organisations. And I know certainly the government's wanting to invest in this area, and I know they want to do a piece of work up to 2027, but as far as we're concerned at DV New South Wales, that can't come quick enough. And I know a wonderful colleague that I used to work with at White Ribbon called Del Palmer is doing some really good work with the Department of Education in New South Wales. So all public schools are doing respectful relationships education, but that's just public schools. So what we need to see certainly nationally and across Australia is investment into respectful relationships education, and it can't be fly in, fly out work. It needs to be whole of school, whole of community. And certainly with programs I've worked with before, it wouldn't just be about the school, it would be that the school was connected to the local services. So it's kind of driving a real kind of movement around the school and making sure there was kind of referral pathways if they were needed. And it wasn't just about going in and teaching kids what does domestic violence look like. It was also ensuring teachers understood what domestic and family violence looked like, and there was policies and procedures that didn't just sit on the shelf, but they were embedded within the school culture, and there was respect, there was non-bullying, there was kindness, there was care, and it was age-appropriate work, and I think that is so important across Australia right now.
And what are some preventative factors that are likely to help reduce domestic and family violence within families within the community?
Look, adequate housing and adequate income are very high on Barnardos' list because, the education component, which, as Delia's rightly said, is so important, it will give children a voice, but if their voice is competing with lack of adequate housing or they're living in a car, then they're not going to have much control, and indeed their parent is not going to have as much control. It's all too easy for everyday Australian to say, well, why doesn't that woman leave? Or why doesn't the government take the children into care? We don't want to do that, and we don't want to put people in the situation where their hand is forced because they actually don't have enough money to live on. So, and we see that in Barnardos programs across families where there are working parents. It's not just impacting people who are not in the paid workforce, and the programs that we have for children and for women that give them the skills to be able to feel in control of their lives, because a lot of domestic and family violence is linked to control. The more we can give women and children control over their lives, the more we can assist in reducing the amount of violence that occurs in households with children.
Yeah, and I suppose it comes to one of your points that you made earlier as well about our systems and our structures of society need to work together. Our systems need to talk with one another. Experiencing the cost of living in a car, well, that needs to be able to speak to housing. Housing needs to be able to speak to child protection, and all of the other systems working in unison.
With that as well, with that in mind, Matt, we also need to think about the attitudes that we mentioned as well.
Absolutely.
And that also impacts this. Like Deirdre just made a really good point. We often victim blame, and it's like, actually, why didn't she leave? Well, hang on, why didn't he stop? And why did society force her to stay? Because there was no housing, because income's an issue, because there's children, there's financial abuse, there's all these complexities that we're just not talking about or understanding. So it's really easy to victim blame and say, well, she's just not brave, or why didn't she leave? Why can't she get them out of that? But not acknowledge the survival and the strength and the courage in having to stay in that situation. So it's society that needs to look inwardly, and it's about gender inequity, and that's a conversation we also need to have.
Yeah, and a really important and crucial question as well is, what impact is this having on a child?
Absolutely.
And how is this impacting a child in there? Even going to school, focusing at school, it's as simple as those little things that we probably all take for granted. We know that domestic and family violence does have a big impact on how they even learn, and how we're setting up our kids for a success in the future as well.
Yeah. I've had my daycare reach out to me where I've got a 21-month-old baby, and they've reached out to say it'd be great if there could be domestic violence training for the staff, which I think is again a change in the sea. And I think those conversations early on that can be age appropriate are really important, particularly in early childhood settings as well. So we do need to be thinking about every touch point we can have with a child where they might need help. And as we know, most kids can move forward with that one resilient person in their life. Was it the daycare member of staff? Was it the teacher? Was it the neighbour? But really think about the role we can play to support children and young people.
That child-focused conversation,
Yes.
and how we engage them in the conversation.
You know, this is a sad thing to share, but how many domestic homicides or serious case reviews have we all read where the child was never asked how they were? That's just a massive miss. So we have to make sure we keep the child in mind and in sight and ask them how they are. A
recent figure that has been released from the Australian Institute of Family Studies showed that 3 in 10 18 to 19-year-olds had experienced violence from an intimate partner in the past year. What's your take on this, and do you think that we've potentially missed a generation of education?
I don't think we've missed a generation of education, but I think we've missed the community attitude piece, and it seems to have deteriorated when we look at the NCAS survey. So I think we need to rethink how we engage the community and make sure, as I've mentioned before, that we're not working in an echo chamber in the domestic violence space, and that we break out of that and that we're relevant. And I do think that we often can talk about children or we can talk about adults, but we maybe miss young people. And we need to think about resources and access points for young people. There was an incredible campaign in the UK by the Home Office, and it was teenagers in abusive relationships, and there was posters everywhere, there was adverts on the TV, and it brought about a brilliant conversation in the community. And I think we need to be doing a bit more of that public awareness in Australia. And I think young people do need that tailored response as well, but we often kind of say children or adult, but that young people piece tends to be missing. And we know that, I mean, I heard some young people speak recently about domestic violence, and it was absolutely moving and incredible. So there's young people very aware of the issue, but we've got to get that conversation out to teenagers and make sure we've got relevant age appropriate resources for them.
Deirdre, what optimism do we have for the future in the community awareness, or the campaign of building awareness in the community of domestic and family violence?
Well, the more we talk about it, the more it becomes a shared issue and a shared responsibility. And that gives me optimism that we are bolder and braver, and we are teaching our children to be bolder and braver about things that once were unmentionable. And if you look back, there were lots of things 30, 40, 50 years ago that were unmentionable, that now there is lots of public conversation about, often horrified public conversation, but it's in the air and it's in the space. And that's what we need to do with domestic and family violence, because there are no magic bullets or quick fixes here. It's an issue that will only go away with continued spotlight and continued attention, and we all need to be aware of that. We need to not point the finger at any particular person or any particular level of government, because this is something that we all need to be standing up for.
And advocating for the child's voice to be at the forefront, and the impacts that that has on children. Yeah.
Absolutely. Barnardos is focused on children, as we all know, in all aspects of their lives. But when you know that this is a common denominator for virtually every family who comes through our doors, it means we have to actually take up a call for action ongoingly every single day.
And what optimism do you have for the future in community awareness for domestic and family violence?
I think being really proud of a workforce that just works tirelessly and is passionate and experienced and has those calls to action and understands what needs to be done, making sure that certainly as peak body CEO I can represent those voices and really push them forward and propel them forward, and particularly those workers working with children that are so passionate. So really pushing their voices forward, and that does give me optimism. And I think even being in this conversation right now, I mean, I've been involved in probably 20 16 Days of Activism events, and half of them have been about children. And that's different from last year. So I think it's really important that we're keeping children in mind and in focus. And I do think there's the will and the desire, and that keeps me certainly turning up to work every day and keep doing what I'm doing.
What are the long-term or short-term goals that are in the forefront of your mind, Deirdre?
So short-term, definitely conversations day in, day out, ongoingly. Long-term, I would love to see that concept of specialist workers for children in every single local community service, ours and others, not as a clinical therapeutic one-to-one focus exclusively or necessarily, because that's not how children grow and learn. It needs to be embedded into every program so that there is an awareness, and so that every adult, no matter what their profession is, knows how to talk to children about things when they're not okay.
And from Domestic and Family Violence New South Wales perspective, what are the long-term and short-term goals that are at the forefront?
Sure, I'll start with short-term. I think we know that the New South Wales Government are going to drop their prevention strategy in coming months. So the short-term goal here is to ensure it's funded. And I think we can do some really important work in prevention, work across the state, and really, really passionate and dedicated to ensuring that's done properly, that it's grassroots, place-based, community-owned and driven. That's fundamental. That's a short-term goal. Long-term, and I mean, I feel like that's an ongoing goal as well, I should say. Long-term, I think it's better integration of the service system that interacts with children and young people. So really thinking about some kind of service system redesign, may it be, but looking at how we intersect with housing, mental health, child protection. I feel like that's the missing piece at the moment. Every event I'm at, everyone I speak to, it's just like we've got this service system just not operating in the way it needs to. So long-term, we need to really, really think about how we address that.
So thank you for listening to the Barnardos podcast with Deirdre Cheese, our CEO, and also Delia Donovan, Domestic Violence New South Wales CEO. It's been great to speak to you both.
Amazing, thank you.
Matt.